Chapter 16. I've come to give myself up. Daniel had made his mind up. I have been punished, he declared, for putting on paper what, strictly speaking, should have been a verbal report in confidence to my captain. I have ascertained today that as a result of the court-martial sentence, there can be no prospect of advancement for me in the Navy. Therefore, as much as I love the service, it is imperative that I should seek a new profession at once, for the cost of defending my honour has taxed my financial resources to the utmost. I appreciate the promise of the Admiralty of further employment, a promise which is most exceptional in view of the sentence passed on me. But I have to consider what that employment is likely to be, and I now know that it cannot be employment such as I honourably desire. Daniel had some logic behind his decision. It was a time of retrenchment and of budget cutting in the Navy. Officers for whom the Admiralty could see no prospects of being axed, and had to leave without any suggestion of the golden or even silver handshake that a future generation would be offered. As a commander, he had accomplished the first great hurdle of rising from the ranks of automatic promotion on seniority to one of selection on merit. Now, however, he had the smear of a court-martial sentence on his record. Of course, Daniel was not to know of the decision at that meeting of the Lords Commissioners of the Admiralty when it was decided that both he and Dewar had been punished enough. Nor perhaps he bright enough to realise that enough political commotion had been stirred to ensure that questions would most certainly be asked, both in Parliament and in the press, if he were not given suitable employment within a reasonable time. The day would most surely come when the Lordships could dispose of Daniel in any way they choose. However, at that moment, and without question, for some time to come, he was virtually impregnable. If Daniel had taken advice on his decision to leave the Navy, then it was bad advice. He was only 39 years old, had been in the Navy for 25 of them, and had been a commander for 6. He had won the DSO, and had been described as one of the Navy's most brilliant officers of the younger generation. But it is most unlikely that he sought any advice at all. For there was that other Daniel, the man who fancied his hand with a pen, the man who was renowned throughout the Mediterranean fleet for his talent at organising splendid ship's dances, for writing brilliant scripts for ship's concert parties, and for his eagerness at staging amateur dramatics. He had just received an offer from a national daily paper to be its naval correspondent, at a considerably better salary than the half-pay on which he was presently living. In the fashion of a later day, when the capturing of celebrities who were in the news was to become a routine exercise in circulation warfare, the Daily Mail had the bright idea of buying up Daniel. Its sister paper, the Weekly Dispatch, proudly announced that from the following weekend he would write a series of articles entitled The Navy from Within. It went on to list the first 6. Daily life in the Navy, battle exercises, training for war in a battleship, naval administration, how the Navy has changed in the last 20 years, and changes Daniel would like to see. Hardly the sort of stuff to have the public queuing outside the local newsagent on a wet Sunday morning. But the paper did point out that, apart from being an expert on naval affairs, Daniel would also be writing the Daily Mail as an authority on rowing, rugby football and the theatre. The Admiralty studied this announcement with furious interest. Daniel, as we know, was now an officer on half-pay and, while anyone in such a position has a great deal of latitude to embark on all sorts of enterprise, there are limits. Article 17 of King's Regulations and Admiralty Instructions was carefully read and reread, and marginal notes were made, but it was finally decided that by writing of such things as daily life in the Navy, rowing, rugby, football and the theatre, Daniel was contravening no law. Sadly for Daniel, he was no journalist either. He was shed by the Daily Mail as swiftly as he had been appointed, but not before, in his usual impetuous fashion, he had committed an unhappy gaffe or two. The worst was when he allowed his sword, the one that had lain before him at this court-martial, to be displayed in a Piccadilly shop window as a sales promotion for pens. The theme was that the pen, his latest career, was mightier than the sword. This display did him great harm, particularly among those naval officers who, up until then, had been in sympathy with him. After quiet but firm pressure, the sword was removed from the shop window. When he left the Daily Mail, Daniel became a freelance journalist, but with no greater success. He turned to other jobs, but fortune was never on his side when his health deteriorated. When the Second World War broke out, and he was still young enough and possessed experience so badly needed, there came the chance for him to make his peace with the Navy, but he was simply not fit enough. The only glimpse of service life he had was as the commander of a local Home Guard detachment, training the local butcher, baker, and garage owner to defend England should the Germans invade. That, moreover, he found his way to South Africa. From a commander in the Royal Navy, he became some sort of shipping clerk. Lonely and unhappy, he died of arteriosclerosis in the public ward of a hospital in Port Elizabeth in 1955. Dewar behaved differently. He took the Admiralty at its word and waited on half pay for a new appointment to come along, although he was hardly content, for he still resented the attitude of the court-martial and the conduct of the prosecution. He remained utterly convinced of the rightness of his cause. The new appointment was made in September 1928, only 5 months after being dismissed his ship. He was given command of HMS Tiger. True, she was the oldest battle cruiser in the Navy, and was serving only as a gunnery training ship, but she would give him those vital 7 months of sea time that he so badly needed in order to qualify for flag rank. By now, Dewar was among the most senior captains on the list, and it could be merely a matter of months before he was promoted to Rear Admiral. The promotion came, and with it, an appointment as ADC to King George V. But he would never have the opportunity to command again, for he was almost instantly retired. His flag would never fly at a warship's masthead. Yet the fighting was not over for Dewar. In the general election of 1931, he stood for Parliament as a socialist candidate for Portsmouth South. He lost, but polled fairly respectably, well enough to encourage him to think of fighting the seat at the next election. Then, by one of those most unbelievable throws of the dice, Sir Roger Keyes himself was adopted as his Tory opponent. Dewar loftily declined the chance of fighting his old master. In the early 1950s, Dewar was in action again, this time bringing a libel action over a biography of Roger Keyes, written by Brigadier Aspinall Oglander. According to the book, Keyes had written that Dewar and Daniel had made improper use of their nasty parliamentary friends prior to their court-martial. Not only that, but also that they had been responsible for the leaks that had so stirred up the press at the time. Dewar held that this was defamatory, and in due time author and publisher apologised, made a retraction, and paid costs and damages. For once the captain had found the law on his side. During the Second World War, Dewar, to whom tactics at sea had always meant so much, never found a chance to exercise his theories. Instead, he found himself employed at the Admiralty as a historian. The real prizes and honours that he must have felt would come his way never did arrive. Vice Admiral Dewar, like Collard, he was promoted during his retirement, died in 1964 at the age of 84. Vice Admiral Collard made no fuss, and never aired his views publicly. It almost seemed that he made a deliberate attempt to be forgotten. He had retired to the country, and that was the end of it. In 1939, he could have gone back to the Admiralty. Instead, he joined the Observer Corps and spent his time spotting for enemy aircraft. In his off-duty hours, he would go over to a local girls' school and instruct classes in house maintenance, electrics, plumbing, and bricklaying. The stocky little admiral, with his weathered face and limp, proved to be very popular. The war over, and his wife dead, the admiral spent his final years, a solitary man with little more than a fly rod for company. No one knows what he thought of those events at Malta. If he was hurt, and he surely must have been, then he was far too proud to show it. 3 men, broken. 2 completely. 3 careers wrecked. And, however you care to look at it, all over a swear word at a dance. Broken and wrecked might be over-strong words to describe the fate of a 4th officer, Sir Roger Keyes, the Commander-in-Chief Mediterranean Fleet at the time. His career could never be described as in any way a failure, but there is no doubt he did not achieve the highest goal of all, the one he craved, First Sea Lord, and he could not help blaming the confounded Royal Oak business. Keyes had every confidence in the world that he would be given the post a few months after his term as Commander-in-Chief was ended. It all seemed so splendidly organised. When Beatty retired, Admiral of the Fleet Sir Charles Madden had been given the job, in the full knowledge that because of his age, he himself would have to retire in 1929, just in time for Keyes' return from the Mediterranean. The Royal Oak affair and the way Keyes had handled it put an end to that scheme. At the Admiralty, letters were exchanged, memoranda passed, and there was much confidential conversation, little or none of it in Keyes' favour. It would seem that a more powerful figure had taken a hand in the matter. On his return from Malta, Keyes went to see King George V, as was the custom on handing over a fleet. "The King asked me," Keyes wrote afterwards. If there was any precedent in the history of the Navy for one flag officer holding down the flag of another. I said I did not know of one, but I still felt I had done the right thing. The king was exceedingly nice to me, but evidently thought I had made a mess of things. According to the unfortunate Keyes, the king would not let go of the subject for over 35 minutes. He tried to argue, he added, that I had really made a balls of it. We talked that sort of language. The king had not finished with Keyes even then. Harking back to Malta, he said it was a pity that the admiral had encouraged so many young officers to play polo. Keyes fought hard to be First Sea Lord. He even drove to Chequers, the weekend home of Prime Ministers, to lobby the current incumbent, Ramsay MacDonald. For this he received a stiff rebuke from the Admiralty. He also saw a letter from MacDonald saying that the king had already signed the appointment of Admiral Sir Frederick Field, who was 3 years junior to Keyes on the Admiral's list. MacDonald went on to say that he felt injudicious to make the king go back on his signature. So, instead of becoming First Sea Lord, Keyes was appointed Commander-in-Chief of Portsmouth. A splendid post that would have rejoiced many a flag officer. But, as far as Keyes was concerned, his career was merely moving sideways. Eventually he decided that, if he could not take a hand in naval policy at the Admiralty, he would do so in another place. In 1935, he stood for Parliament at Portsmouth and won. Perhaps it was just as well that Captain Dewar did not oppose him. Keyes made quite a name for himself in Parliament, and continued to do so when he became a peer and went to the House of Lords. But he never forgot how close he had come to the biggest prize in his career, and how the Royal Oak business had damned it. It would be absurdly wrong to make Day Kimball, the expatriate American defence lawyer, another victim of that dance aboard Royal Oak, yet even his career took a strange and unfortunate turn. He became an alcoholic, fought it and recovered, never married, but took a mistress instead. During the Second World War, he became assistant judge to the Supreme Court in Bermuda. After that, he returned to his birthplace in the United States where, sadly, he took to the bottle again. There was one more victim. The life of Bandmaster Percy Edward Barnacle, Royal Marines, was affected just as deeply as any of his senior officers. Percy Barnacle was a shy and sensitive man, perhaps as a result of his experience in the orphanage. He certainly never got over his horrifying ordeal when he was trapped below decks in a sinking ship during the First World War. Giving evidence at both courts-martial had been a torture to him. That was plain. 3 years later, in 1931, he left the Royal Marines to find work ashore, but he never lost touch with the service or his music. He and his wife moved to Plymouth, where he became involved with the Plymouth Silver City Band and was once more connected with the Royal Marines, this time with the Commander-in-Chief, Plymouth Band, which rather discredits Admiral Collard's view of his ability. Band music has always played a most important part in the life of Britain's miners, and it was about that time that Bettishanger in Kent, one of the best-known collieries in Britain, was seeking a new bandmaster. The band approached the commanding officer of the Royal Marine Musical School at Deal, only a few miles away. Without hesitation, he recommended that they approach Barnacle, so the retired bandmaster came home to his adopted county, the depot in which he trained, and a new task. The band flourished, and so did Percy Barnacle. He became a church warden in Deal and raised a family, a boy and a girl. Arthur, the son, grew to be a strapping lad, looming over his father's mere 5.5 feet. When he left school, he followed in his father's hardy polished boots and became a Royal Marine, not as a musician, but as a member of a commando. One day he was to discover, with considerable pride, what a close family sea life is, and just how much his father was part of its legend. Long after the Second World War, he and his commando landed in Hong Kong on exercises. They fell in on the parade ground for inspection by the general officer commanding the station. The inspection over, the commando marched away with the exception of Arthur Barnacle, who had been ordered to stand fast. The general approached him. "Tell me," he asked, "are you really Bandmaster Barnacle's boy?" Then he wished him well. The Royal Marines most assuredly look after their own. Father Barnacle led a very full life. After years with the Bettshanger Colliery Band, he became an instructor at the Royal Marine Music School in Deal. As such, he was entitled to use the officers' mess, but it was only when his son became an instructor too, and led the way, that he would enter it. He felt he simply did not belong. Percy Barnacle, who always called his doctor Sir, even from his pillow. The gentle orphan boy who never swore was obviously the very last man who should ever have been cursed by an irascible rear admiral. Percy's wife died and he grew frail. He settled down to live in an old people's home in Deal, close by the things that mattered most to him, his church and the Royal Marine Depot. One afternoon in 1979, Bandmaster Barnacle, aged 87, put on his jacket and set out for a walk to the depot. Although not far in the ordinary way, it was quite a distance for him in his state of health. He passed between the whitewashed pillars and the open gates and headed for the guardroom. The young corporal of the guard, as sharply creased, as smoothly pressed, and as immaculately polished as any Royal Marine corporal of the guard could ever be, quite naturally did not recognise him, and in a friendly way stopped him. "I've come to give myself up," explained the small, weary ex-Bandmaster Barnacle. "That court-martial, I didn't want to give evidence against the Admiral." The young corporal was utterly baffled until Percy found the words to explain. Then he was kind and gentle with the old man, found him a seat in which to rest and a cup of tea for him to drink. After that, he guided the old man onto his path home. Bandmaster Percy Barnacle died 5 years later, in 1984, at the age of 92, the last survivor of all those involved in that scene on Royal Oak's quarterdeck so many years before. Remorse never left him. By those words of his to the youthful corporal, "I never wanted to give evidence," Bandmaster Barnacle showed he had far more common sense than Commander-in-Chief, Admiral, Captain and Commander put together. So concludes the Royal Oak Affair, the saga of Admiral Connaught and Bandmaster Barnacle, written by Robert Glenton. Thank you very much for listening.